My mother-in-law once told me, at her own dinner table, that I'd never truly belong in this family, no matter how long I stayed married to her son. 3 years later, sitting across from her lawyers in a courtroom, they slid a settlement offer across the table that I laughed at out loud in front of everyone. But to understand how I got from that dinner table to that courtroom, I need to take you back to the day I married into a family that never once let me forget where I came from. I married into money I didn't grow up with, and I want to be honest that I knew from the very first family dinner exactly how that money intended to make me feel about it. My name doesn't matter for this story. What matters is that I grew up the daughter of a single mother who worked 2 jobs to keep us in a small rental house, and that I met my husband, Andrew, during my final year of college, at a part-time job in a coffee shop near his family's downtown office building. He came in most mornings, always polite, always left a genuinely generous tip, and it took him almost 3 months of quiet, patient conversation before he finally asked me out, an approach so different from the entitled confidence I later learned most of his social circle carried that I didn't even initially clock him as coming from serious money. Andrew's family ran a commercial development company that had built half the office parks in our city, the kind of quiet, generational wealth that doesn't announce itself with flashy cars so much as with the specific, unshakable certainty of people who've never once had to worry about whether they belonged in a room. His mother, Patricia, was the family's true architect of both the business and its social standing, a woman whose approval, I learned very quickly, functioned as the actual currency of that entire family, more valuable than any amount of money Andrew's father had built over the decades. Andrew himself never seemed particularly invested in the family's social hierarchy during our early months together, which was part of what drew me to him in the first place. He talked about wanting to eventually branch out from the family business, maybe start something of his own in a completely different industry, dreams he confided to me with a kind of earnest hesitancy that suggested he wasn't entirely sure his family would take such ambitions seriously. Looking back now, I understand that Andrew existed his entire life in a specific, uncomfortable middle space, benefiting enormously from his family's wealth and standing while simultaneously chafing against the expectations that came attached to it, a tension he never fully resolved, and one that, I now believe, made him more susceptible than he should have been to eventually seeking out someone his family found effortlessly acceptable. I met Patricia for the first time at a dinner about 4 months into dating Andrew, and I remember the specific, practiced warmth of her greeting, the kind of hospitality that somehow manages to feel like an inspection at the same time. She asked me detailed questions about my education, my family background, my plans, questions delivered with a smile that never once reached her eyes. When I mentioned, in passing, that my mother worked as a hotel housekeeper, I watched something flicker across Patricia's face, gone almost as quickly as it appeared, but unmistakable to anyone paying close attention, which I had learned by then to do constantly in that family's presence. The comments started small and never really stopped over the years that followed. Patricia would mention, at seemingly every family gathering, some detail about people like us or our world, phrases that drew an invisible but unmistakable line with me consistently on the wrong side of it. She once told me, at her own dinner table, in front of Andrew's siblings and their partners, that she admired how well I'd adapted to their lifestyle, a comment delivered with a smile that made the insult nearly impossible to call out directly without appearing oversensitive, the specific verbal weaponry wealthy people perfect over generations of practice. Andrew, to his credit in those early years, would occasionally push back gently against his mother's comments, though never quite forcefully enough to make her stop entirely. I told myself, for a long time, that this was simply the price of marrying into a complicated family, that Patricia's coldness would eventually thaw once she understood I wasn't going anywhere, that the marriage itself would eventually earn me the acceptance her approval seemed to require. We married when I was 26. In a wedding Patricia insisted on funding almost entirely herself, a generosity that came, I learned quickly, with an unspoken assumption of control over every detail, down to a guest list that mysteriously excluded several of my own close friends in favor of business associates I'd never met. I let it go at the time, telling myself it wasn't worth the conflict. a pattern of quiet accommodation that, looking back, set a precedent for the entire marriage that followed. I remember one specific moment from the wedding planning that I still think about often. I'd wanted my mother to walk me down the aisle alongside a small, informal reading from my grandmother, who had helped raise me during my mother's long work hours. Patricia gently suggested, in a conversation that felt collaborative at the time but reads, in memory, as something closer to a directive, that a more traditional ceremony structure would photograph better and align more comfortably with the venue she'd already selected. I agreed, telling myself the specific details didn't matter as much as the marriage itself, not yet understanding that this would become the exact pattern of every subsequent negotiation between us. My preferences quietly reframed as impractical, hers subtly established as simply how things were done. The years that followed were, on the surface, comfortable ones. Andrew worked in the family business, a role that came with considerable financial security, but also, I began to notice over time, an increasing deference to his mother's opinions on virtually every aspect of our life together, from where we should live to how we should raise the children we eventually had. I built my own modest career as a marketing consultant during those years, something Patricia treated with a kind of amused condescension, occasionally suggesting, at family functions, that I didn't really need to work at all, a comment that always managed to sound like generosity while functioning as something closer to erasure. I want to talk about the specific texture of feeling perpetually on trial within your own marriage, because I think it's a dynamic that doesn't get discussed enough in stories about wealth and class. It wasn't any single dramatic incident that wore me down over those years. It was the accumulation of 1,000 small moments. Patricia's slightly too long pause before including me in a family photo, her habit of directing wedding and holiday planning questions to Andrew even when they concerned our own household, the specific, practiced way she'd introduce me to her friends with my maiden name still attached, as though marriage itself hadn't fully naturalized my belonging. The affair, when I eventually discovered it, involved a woman named Vanessa, someone from Andrew's own social circle, the daughter of one of Patricia's closest friends, a detail that told me almost everything I needed to know about how deeply this entire situation had been enabled, even if not directly orchestrated, by the specific ecosystem Patricia had built around her son. Vanessa was, by every metric that seemed to matter to that family, exactly the kind of woman Andrew should have married in the first place, someone from the same social stratum, someone whose own family's wealth made her an equal rather than, as I'd always been treated, a project requiring careful management and quiet tolerance. I'd actually met Vanessa on several occasions over the years, at charity galas and family functions, always polite, always perfectly at ease in exactly the way I'd spent over a decade trying and failing to master. I remember, in the aftermath of everything, going back through years of memory and recognizing small moments that felt, in retrospect, unmistakably charged, a particular lingering conversation at a fundraiser 2 years earlier, an offhand comment from Patricia about how well Vanessa and Andrew always seemed to understand each other's world. I hadn't thought much of these moments at the time, filed them away as simply the natural ease of people who'd grown up in the same social cycles, not yet understanding I was watching the slow, patient groundwork of something that would eventually detonate my entire marriage. I discovered the affair through a series of small inconsistencies that built, over about 2 months, into an undeniable pattern, culminating in a moment where I found a hotel receipt in Andrew's jacket pocket for a date he told me he was spending at a business conference in another city. The conference, it turned out, when I checked, hadn't actually taken place that particular weekend at all. The confrontation itself was almost anticlimactic compared to the months of quiet, accumulating suspicion that preceded it. Andrew didn't deny it once I presented the evidence, seemed almost relieved, in a strange way, to finally stop maintaining the deception, though his relief translated into very little actual remorse. He told me, with a kind of weary honesty that somehow made everything worse, that things with Vanessa felt easier, a word that landed with particular cruelty given everything I'd endured trying to unease within his family for over a decade. What I hadn't expected, in the aftermath of that confrontation, was Patricia's reaction. Rather than the outrage I might have anticipated from a mother learning her son had betrayed his wife, she seemed, if anything, quietly relieved that the situation had finally come into the open, treating the affair less as a moral failing and more as an inconvenient but perhaps inevitable outcome of a marriage she'd never fully endorsed in the first place. She suggested, in a conversation I still find remarkable in its coldness, that perhaps it was time for everyone to be honest about what would actually make Andrew happy going forward, a phrase that made unmistakably clear whose happiness had always mattered most in that family's calculations. I want to be honest about something. In the weeks immediately following the discovery, I genuinely considered simply leaving quietly, taking as little as I reasonably could, partly out of exhaustion, and partly because some deeply internalized part of me still believed, after all those years, that I didn't fully deserve to fight for more than the bare minimum. It was my own mother, of all people, who talked me out of that instinct, sitting with me over coffee one evening and reminding me, in her characteristically direct way, that I'd spent over a decade being made to feel like a guest in my own marriage, and that walking away quietly now would simply confirm, one final time, the exact story Patricia had always told about my place in that family. My mother had watched, over the years, more of the small indignities than I'd ever fully realized, quiet observations she'd apparently kept mostly to herself out of respect for my own choices, but that came pouring out during that conversation with a clarity that startled me. She reminded me of a Christmas years earlier, when Patricia had made a pointed comment about my mother's coat in front of the entire family, and how I'd laughed it off at the time rather than defending her, a moment I'd genuinely forgotten until she brought it up, ashamed all over again at how thoroughly I'd absorbed that family's specific brand of casual cruelty as simply the cost of belonging. She told me, plainly, that whatever I decided to do about the divorce itself, I owed it to both of us to at least find out what I was actually entitled to before deciding what to walk away from. I hired a divorce attorney who specialized specifically in high-asset cases involving family businesses, a decision that turned out to matter enormously once the specifics of the marital estate came under examination. My first meeting with her was almost disorienting in its thoroughness, an exhaustive intake process that required me to reconstruct, as precisely as I could, over a decade of financial decisions I'd never fully understood at the time, since Andrew and his family had always handled the more complex aspects of our household finances. Another small way, I realized only in retrospect, that I'd been subtly kept at a remove from full participation in my own life. What emerged, over the following months of discovery, was something I hadn't fully anticipated. Andrew's family had, over the years, structured significant portions of what I'd always understood as separate family business assets in ways that, under our state's marital property laws, actually qualified as marital assets subject to division due to specific decisions Andrew himself had made regarding how his compensation and equity had been structured during our marriage. My attorney explained this to me carefully over several long meetings, walking me through the specific mechanisms by which stock options, deferred compensation, and certain trust distributions Andrew had received during our marriage had, functionally, become part of our shared marital estate regardless of the family's original intentions about keeping that wealth separate. Patricia's lawyers fought this characterization aggressively, treating the entire marital estate as though it existed in some untouchable category simply because it originated from family wealth that predated our marriage. But my attorney's forensic accountant found, methodically, exactly how much of that supposedly separate wealth had actually been commingled and restructured in ways that made it fair game, a technical, unglamorous kind of victory that had nothing to do with moral vindication and everything to do with the specific, careful language of marital property statutes. The settlement conference where Patricia's lawyer first slid an offer across the table, the moment I mentioned at the start of this story, involved a figure so insultingly low, calculated on the assumption that I'd be too exhausted or too intimidated by their legal team to actually contest it seriously, that I genuinely laughed out loud, an unplanned, involuntary reaction that visibly unsettled everyone on the other side of that table far more than any prepared statement could have. I remember Patricia's expression in that moment, the first time in over a decade of knowing her that I'd seen something resembling genuine uncertainty cross her face. The actual negotiation that followed took nearly 8 more months, methodical and exhausting in ways that had nothing to do with courtroom drama and everything to do with careful documentation, forensic accounting, and a legal team that understood exactly how to unwind years of deliberately complicated financial structuring. I won't pretend the final settlement represented some fairy tale windfall. What it represented was a fair, legally accurate accounting of what I was actually entitled to under the marriage's real financial structure, once the smoke and mirrors of separate family wealth had been properly examined and, in significant part, dismantled. I want to talk about the specific satisfaction, complicated and imperfect as it was, of watching Patricia finally have to reckon with the actual legal reality of a marriage she'd always treated as somehow beneath serious consideration. During one particularly tense negotiation session, she attempted, once more, to suggest that I was somehow taking advantage of Andrew's guilt over the affair to extract an unfair settlement, a framing my attorney dismantled within minutes by walking through, line by line, the actual legal basis for every figure we were requesting, none of which had anything to do with punishing Andrew for infidelity and everything to do with what the law actually entitled me to. The divorce finalized just over a year after I first discovered the affair. Andrew and Vanessa married less than a year later, a union that Patricia, I heard through mutual acquaintances, embraced with an enthusiasm she'd never once extended to me in over a decade of marriage, planning an elaborate wedding within months of an engagement that most people in their social circle understood, without anyone needing to say it directly, had likely been unfolding well before my own marriage officially ended. I used part of the settlement to start my own marketing agency, something I'd always wanted to do but had never quite found the confidence or capital to pursue while still trying to manage the constant, low-grade project of proving my worth within Andrew's family. The first year of building that agency was, in its own way, harder than the divorce itself, full of the specific uncertainty that comes with betting on your own judgment after a decade of having your instincts subtly second-guessed. But it was also, I think, the first sustained period of my adult life where every decision, every success, and every mistake belonged entirely to me, unfiltered through anyone else's approval. The business has grown steadily over the years since, built entirely on my own client relationships and my own reputation, a specific kind of success that feels different, more solid somehow than anything I ever experienced within a marriage where my contributions always seemed to require justification. I hired my first employee about 2 years in, a young woman who reminded me, in small ways, of myself at that age, someone talented and slightly unsure of her own worth, and I've made a quiet, deliberate practice of never once making her feel the way I spent over a decade feeling in that family, an intention that has become, unexpectedly, one of the most meaningful parts of running my own company. I think, sometimes, about the specific moment Patricia told me, all those years ago, that I'd never truly belong in that family no matter how long I stayed married to her son. I understand now that she was, in her own limited way, telling me something true, just not in the way she intended. I never did belong in the specific world she'd built, the one defined by inherited wealth and careful social gatekeeping and a particular, brittle certainty about who deserved genuine respect and who simply needed to be tolerated. But I built something else instead, something that belongs entirely to me, built on my own terms, answerable to no one's approval but my own. My children, who were 9 and 11 when the divorce finalized, split time between Andrew's household and mine, and I've watched, with a complicated mixture of vigilance and hope, for early signs of the same dynamics I endured for over a decade, watching Patricia's interactions with my daughter especially, alert to any hint of the same subtle diminishment I once accepted as simply the price of belonging. So far, thankfully, my daughter seems to have inherited more of my own directness than any inclination toward quiet accommodation, correcting her grandmother on more than one occasion I've heard about secondhand, when Patricia's old habits of casual condescension surface in ways my daughter finds refreshingly, simply rude rather than something requiring careful, diplomatic tolerance. I've made a deliberate point, in the years since, of talking to both my children openly and honestly about what happened, calibrated appropriately for their ages as they've grown, not to turn them against their father or grandmother, but because I never want them to internalize the specific lesson I spent over a decade absorbing without ever quite naming it. The lesson that love and acceptance are things you must continuously earn through quiet accommodation rather than things you're simply entitled to as a full, equal member of a family. My son, now a teenager, asked me directly last year whether I regretted marrying his father at all, given everything that happened. I told him honestly that I didn't, because the marriage gave me both of them, but that I regretted deeply how long it took me to understand that tolerating diminishment wasn't the same thing as genuinely belonging anyway. If you take one thing from this story, let it be this. Money and legal complexity can be weaponized to make you feel like you don't deserve what's actually legally, rightfully yours, especially within a marriage where your worth was always subtly measured against a family's inherited certainty about who belongs and who doesn't. But the law, when properly and patiently applied, doesn't actually care about that certainty. It cares about the facts, carefully documented, methodically presented. Sometimes the most satisfying justice isn't a dramatic confrontation at all. It's simply, finally, being seen accurately by a system that owes you nothing except a fair accounting of what you actually built together, whether or not the people around you ever fully acknowledge that you helped build it.